And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode explores why human beings consistently make irrational decisions, despite centuries of philosophical inquiry and scientific advancement. From Plato's rational ideal to Kahneman and Tversky's cognitive bias research, we unravel how the brain's shortcuts evolved for survival now misfire in modern contexts. Whether in politics, economics, or personal choices, these biases shape our perceptions, reinforce our beliefs, and distort our judgments, often without us realizing it. Can we ever truly think rationally, or are we forever at the mercy of our cognitive limitations? For book recommendations related to this episode, further research topics, key search terms, and a way to buy me a coffee, visit the episode page. Let's dive in. Why do we make bad decisions? The question is not new. Philosophers, economists, and psychologists have wrestled with it for centuries, yet the answers have often been unsatisfying. Traditional rationalist thought, from Plato to Descartes, assumed that human beings, when given the right information, would reason their way to correct conclusions. This view underpins Enlightenment ideals, the foundation of liberal democracy and classical economic theory. Yet, real-world behaviour has consistently defied this expectation. We are not the rational agents of John Stuart Mill's utilitarian calculus, nor the logical decision-makers of Adam Smith's invisible hand. Instead, we are creatures of instinct, emotion, and deeply ingrained cognitive habits that evolved long before the complexities of modern society. The recognition that human reasoning is flawed is not new. In Novum Organum, 1620, Francis Bacon described the idols of the mind, systematic errors that distort human perception and understanding. Yet the first systematic dismantling of the myth of human rationality did not come until the late 20th century, when Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky demonstrated that biases are not random mistakes but predictable, systematic distortions in thinking. Their research revealed that our brains rely on mental shortcuts, heuristics, to make sense of the world. These shortcuts are fast, efficient, and often useful, but they come at a cost. They lead us to errors so consistent that they can be mapped, studied, and in some cases even predicted. Evolution rather than logic has shaped human thought. Leda, Cosmides, and John Tooby, pioneers of evolutionary psychology, argue that our cognitive architecture was designed for survival, not for perfect rationality. The brain, like any biological system, developed under constraints: energy efficiency, speed, and adaptability to a world where immediate threats were more pressing than abstract reasoning. In this environment, heuristics were essential. The ability to make snap judgments about potential dangers or opportunities, whether to flee from rustling in the grass or trust a familiar face, was more valuable than painstaking deliberation. But what worked in the ancestral savannah does not always serve us in a world of complex financial markets, political institutions, and digital misinformation. Bounded rationality, a concept introduced by Herbert Simon in 1957, offers a crucial insight. Humans do not optimize, they satisfice. That is, instead of making the best possible decision, we make decisions that are good enough given the limits of time, knowledge, and cognitive capacity. This understanding bridges the gap between classical economics and behavioral science, explaining why even highly educated individuals, with uncertainty, fall prey to the same predictable biases as everyone else. The realization that our minds are not built for perfect logic is unsettling. It suggests that many of our deeply held beliefs, our political convictions, our financial decisions, and even our personal relationships may be shaped not by careful reasoning, but by mental shortcuts that evolved to solve problems vastly different from the ones we face today. If rationality itself is constrained by evolution, how much control do we truly have over our decisions? The mind does not seek truth, it seeks confirmation. This simple, unsettling reality shapes everything from personal beliefs to global politics. Francis Bacon first observed that humans mark the hits and ignore the misses, selectively remembering information that supports their existing views while discarding contradictory evidence. Centuries later, Karl Popper refined this insight, arguing that scientific progress depends on falsifiability, the willingness to test and reject one's own theories. Yet, the human mind resists such scrutiny. Instead of searching for disconfirmation, we instinctively seek reinforcement, constructing a reality in which we are always right. This is confirmation bias, perhaps the most insidious of all cognitive distortions. Psychologist Raymond Nickerson demonstrated how deeply ingrained this tendency is, showing that people do not merely favour supportive evidence, they actively avoid exposure to opposing viewpoints. In an experiment where participants were given a choice between reading arguments that supported or challenged their beliefs, most chose the former. The implication is profound. Bias is not just an accidental byproduct of thought. It is embedded in the very way we process information. When confronted with conflicting data, the brain activates its defensive mechanisms. Cognitive dissonance, a concept introduced by Leon Festinger, explains this reaction. When faced with evidence that contradicts their views, people experience discomfort, which they resolve by dismissing or rationalizing the contradiction rather than reconsidering their position. The implications extend far beyond individual reasoning. In politics, confirmation bias fuels ideological echo chambers, ensuring that partisans reinforce their beliefs by consuming media aligned with their existing perspectives. Cass Sunstein in Republic.com warned that the internet, rather than broadening perspectives, allows individuals to curate their own informational environments, reducing exposure to opposing arguments. The result is a world in which beliefs are not tested but entrenched, where disagreements harden into intractable divisions. In science, this bias manifests in selective data interpretation. Researchers unconsciously favour results that align with their hypotheses, a problem so widespread that entire fields have developed methodological safeguards to counteract it. The power of confirmation bias is amplified by modern technology. Social media algorithms optimize for engagement, not truth, feeding users content that reinforces their preferences and intensifies their pre-existing views. Eli Paris's concept of the filter bubble describes how these digital environments isolate people within self-reinforcing information loops. The more a user engages with a particular viewpoint, the more the algorithm supplies similar content, strengthening the illusion that their perspective is universally valid. The danger is not just intellectual stagnation, but a fractured society where competing realities exist side by side, each fortified by its own self-validating evidence. If the mind instinctively avoids disconfirmation, how can truth ever prevail? The answer, Popper argued, lies in a culture of rigorous skepticism, where ideas are constantly tested against contrary evidence. Yet this demands an intellectual humility that runs counter to human nature. The philosopher John Stuart Mill warned that those unwilling to engage with opposing views do not truly understand their own beliefs. The challenge, then, is not just to seek truth, but to resist the comforting illusion of certainty. If we are to think clearly, we must learn to doubt ourselves. But can a mind wired for confirmation ever truly embrace contradiction? Loss weighs heavier than gain. This fundamental asymmetry in human psychology distorts decision-making in ways that defy classical economic theory. Traditional models, from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill, assume that individuals make rational choices based on utility maximization. Yet, real-world behavior contradicts this notion. People hold onto failing investments, persist in doomed relationships, and double down on strategic blunders, not because logic dictates it, but because of a deep-seated aversion to acknowledging loss. This is the sunk cost fallacy, a cognitive distortion that compels individuals to justify past decisions rather than accept and move on from failure. Richard Thaler, a pioneer of behavioral economics, demonstrated that sunk costs, past expenditures of time, effort, or money, irrationally influence future decisions. Economic theory dictates that only future costs and benefits should matter. What has already been spent is irrelevant. Yet, in practice, people treat past investments as though they must be recouped, even when further commitment leads to greater harm. This effect is particularly pronounced in high-stakes environments. Political leaders escalate failing wars, fearing that withdrawal would dishonour previous sacrifices. Corporate executives continue funding unprofitable projects to avoid admitting strategic miscalculations. Individuals remain in unhappy relationships, unwilling to let go of years spent trying to make them work. In each case, the fallacy leads to a spiral of escalating commitment where bad decisions are sustained over the psychological discomfort of recognizing them as mistakes. Psychologists Kahneman and Tversky, in their formulation of prospect theory, revealed why loss aversion underpins this phenomenon. People perceive losses as more psychologically impactful than equivalent gains, a tendency deeply rooted in evolutionary survival mechanisms. In environments where resources were scarce, abandoning an investment, whether in food, shelter, or alliances, could mean the difference between survival and extinction. This ancient instinct persists in modern decision-making, leading individuals to irrationally persist in failing endeavors. Neuroeconomic research confirms that the same brain regions associated with physical pain are activated when people experience financial loss, explaining why admitting failure feels so viscerally unpleasant. The consequences of the sunk cost fallacy extend far beyond personal regret. Governments pour billions into failed policies rather than accept political embarrassment. Investors resist cutting losses in collapsing markets, worsening economic downturns. Even in everyday life, people continue reading books they dislike, watching movies they are not enjoying, and staying in careers that no longer fulfill them, all because the thought of wasting past effort is unbearable. The irony is that these attempts to justify prior decisions often lead to greater long-term costs, both financially and psychologically. Is there an escape from this cognitive trap? The economist Thomas Schelling suggested that rationality requires emotional detachment from past investments, an ability to see decisions in terms of future utility rather than past expenditure. Stoic philosophers, from Epictetus to Marcus Aurelius, argued that clinging to past losses is an illusion, that true wisdom lies in accepting impermanence. Yet, in a world where personal identity is often tied to past choices, how does one relinquish attachment without feeling that something valuable has been lost? If human nature resists abandoning investment, can reason ever fully override emotion? Ignorance is invisible to the ignorant. The less people know, the more they overestimate their competence. This paradox, formally identified in 1999 by psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger, reveals a troubling flaw in human self-perception. Those with the least knowledge or skill in a domain are the most confident in their abilities, while experts, by contrast, often doubt their own competence. This cognitive bias distorts everything from personal decision-making to politics, education, and leadership, reinforcing a world where misplaced confidence often outshines genuine expertise. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not simply arrogance, it is a failure of metacognition, the ability to assess one's own knowledge accurately. Socrates' assertion that wisdom begins with the recognition of one's ignorance foreshadowed this psychological reality. Yet, rather than embracing intellectual humility, most individuals assume that their understanding is more complete than it truly is. Dunning and Kruger demonstrated this in a series of experiments where participants took tests in logical reasoning, grammar, and humour. Those who performed worst consistently believed they had done significantly better than their actual scores indicated. In contrast, those who performed best tended to underestimate their ranking, assuming that what was obvious to them must be obvious to everyone. This overconfidence bias has profound implications for society. The historian Barbara Tuchman, in The March of Folly, chronicled how governments throughout history persisted in disastrous policies, unable to recognize their own incompetence. Political populism thrives on this cognitive distortion, as individuals who lack the depth to grasp complex issues are often the most certain in their simplistic solutions. In public discourse, unqualified opinions often carry as much weight as expert analysis, not because they are valid, but because they are delivered with conviction. Social media amplifies this effect, rewarding confidence over accuracy and reinforcing a culture where expertise is dismissed as elitism. The neurological basis of the Dunning-Kruger effect lies in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for higher-order thinking and self-reflection. Research in cognitive neuroscience suggests that the same abilities required to perform a task well are also necessary to evaluate one's performance accurately. When these abilities are weak, individuals lack the cognitive tools to recognize their own limitations. This explains why learning is often accompanied by a painful awareness of how little one actually knows, while ignorance provides the illusion of mastery. Can this bias be corrected? John Stuart Mill argued that exposure to opposing viewpoints is essential for intellectual humility, yet the problem lies in recognizing the need for such exposure in the first place. Education, particularly in critical thinking, can mitigate the effect by fostering habits of self-questioning. However, the very people most susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect often resist intellectual challenge, reinforcing their misplaced confidence. If wisdom requires the recognition of ignorance, but ignorance blinds individuals to their own limitations, can self-awareness ever truly be cultivated? Or is the human mind destined to believe it knows more than it does? Fear distorts judgment. The more vivid an event, the more likely we are to overestimate its probability. This is the availability heuristic, a cognitive shortcut first identified by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in 1973, which explains why people fear plane crashes more than car accidents, shark attacks more than heart disease, and terrorism more than household accidents. Despite statistical evidence showing that these dramatic events are far less common than mundane dangers, the mind latches onto striking images and emotional narratives, overriding logic with instinct. The consequence is a profound misalignment between perceived and actual risk, shaping everything from public policy to personal decision-making. The availability heuristic operates on a simple mechanism. The ease with which an example comes to mind influences our perception of its frequency. Paul Slovic, a leading researcher in risk perception, demonstrated how media coverage amplifies this bias. Events that are shocking, unusual, or tragic dominate news cycles, creating the illusion that they occur more frequently than they do. In contrast, slow-moving crises, climate change, chronic diseases, systemic economic instability fail to trigger the same psychological urgency because they lack the immediate, emotionally charged imagery that the human brain finds compelling. The result is a public that fears terrorism more than heart disease, despite the latter being far deadlier. The roots of this bias lie in evolutionary psychology. For early humans, survival depended on quickly recognizing threats based on past experience. A single sighting of a predator or a nearby tribal conflict was enough to justify heightened vigilance, as ignoring such dangers could be fatal. Yet in modern environments, this mental shortcut misfires. The prevalence of mass media and social networks floods the brain with dramatic but statistically unrepresentative events, reinforcing exaggerated fears. This has political consequences. Governments often prioritize policies that address highly publicized dangers rather than those that would save the most lives. After terrorist attacks, resources are poured into counter-terrorism measures, even though preventable health issues claim far more victims. Public health campaigns struggle against this bias, as diseases that kill millions receive far less attention than rare but sensationalized threats. The availability heuristic also affects personal decisions. People purchase insurance for unlikely catastrophes while neglecting common financial risks. Parents fear child abduction by strangers, despite overwhelming evidence that the real dangers lie within familiar environments. Investors overreact to recent market crashes, assuming that a downturn is more likely simply because it has just occurred. Even in law enforcement, policymakers allocate resources based on high-profile crimes rather than statistical trends, leading to inefficient and sometimes harmful policies. Is there a way to counteract this bias? Kahneman suggests that deliberate statistical thinking, relying on data rather than gut feeling, is the only antidote. Yet the emotional weight of vivid imagery is difficult to override. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that fear is the mother of morality, shaping human behavior in ways that often defy reason. If fear is more persuasive than logic, and the brain is wired to prioritize the memorable over the probable, can reason ever truly overcome instinct? Or are we forever trapped in a world where the most terrifying possibilities seem more real than the most dangerous realities? First impressions shape reality. A single trait, charm, attractiveness, confidence, can colour an entire judgment, influencing how we perceive intelligence, competence, and morality. This is the halo effect, first identified by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920 and later expanded upon by cognitive scientists studying the biases that shape human perception. The phenomenon explains why physically attractive people are assumed to be more intelligent, why charismatic leaders are perceived as competent regardless of their actual skills, and why an initial positive impression can override contradictory evidence. The mind does not evaluate qualities in isolation. Instead, it constructs a coherent narrative, often at the expense of accuracy. Thorndike's research showed that when individuals excelled in one domain, observers tended to assume they excelled in others. In military evaluations, soldiers rated as physically attractive or socially confident were more likely to be judged as possessing leadership skills, mechanical aptitude, and even moral character. Decades later, further studies confirmed this bias across various fields. In courtroom settings, defendants with more attractive appearances receive lighter sentences than those deemed less appealing. In business, tall individuals are more likely to be promoted to executive positions, not because height correlates with leadership ability, but because of unconscious associations between physical presence and authority. In education, students perceived as more likable often receive higher grades, even when their work is of similar quality to their peers. The halo effect is not just a cognitive shortcut, it is a fundamental distortion in how humans perceive reality. Daniel Kahneman describes this as a form of cognitive coherence, the brain's tendency to create consistent narratives from limited information. If someone appears competent in one domain, it feels natural to assume they must be competent in others. The philosopher Bertrand Russell warned against this illusion, noting that charisma and intelligence are often mistaken for wisdom. The consequence is that flawed but confident individuals rise to power, while those who are more qualified but less charismatic are overlooked. This bias is particularly powerful in politics. Studies have shown that voters form strong opinions about candidates within seconds of seeing their faces. Alexander Todorov's research at Princeton demonstrated that split-second judgments of a politician's facial structure predict election outcomes with surprising accuracy. The same effect influences hiring decisions, where interviewers unconsciously favour candidates who seem competent based on irrelevant factors such as voice tone, body language, or personal style. Even in personal relationships, the halo effect distorts judgment. An individual who makes a strong first impression is often excused for later flaws, while those who start with a poor impression struggle to overcome it. Can this illusion be resisted? Kahneman suggests that slow, deliberate thinking can counteract automatic biases, but in real-world interactions, snap judgments dominate. Aristotle argued that true character is revealed over time, not in single moments, yet modern society rewards instant impressions. In a world where first impressions dictate careers, elections, and even justice, how much of our perception is shaped by reality, and how much is an illusion created by the mind? If confidence and charm outweigh competence, can we ever trust our own instincts about others? Ownership distorts value. People overestimate the worth of what they possess, not because of its intrinsic qualities, but simply because it is theirs. This is the endowment effect, first identified by economist Richard Thaler in the 1980s, which demonstrates that individuals demand more to sell an item than they would be willing to pay to acquire it. Classical economic theory, from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman, assumes that people assign value rationally based on market equilibrium and personal utility. Yet behavioural experiments reveal a fundamental asymmetry. Once ownership is established, rational calculations give way to emotional attachment. This bias skews economic decisions, legal disputes, and even personal identity, shaping how people interact with objects, investments, and ideas. Thaler's experiments demonstrated this effect with a simple study. Participants randomly given coffee mugs placed significantly higher selling prices on them than those who were asked how much they would pay to buy the same mugs. This contradiction violated standard economic predictions, revealing that ownership creates an irrational premium. Subsequent research extended this bias beyond physical goods. Homeowners overprice their houses, believing them to be worth more than the market dictates. Investors hold on to failing stocks, unable to part with them at a loss, even when logic suggests reallocating funds. Gamblers, having already bet on a losing hand, resist folding, believing their earlier investment justifies continued risk. In each case, the psychological burden of giving something up distorts its perceived value. Neuroscience has identified the biological basis of this bias. Brain imaging studies show that the insular cortex, a region linked to pain and emotional processing, activates when individuals consider relinquishing possessions. Loss aversion, as outlined in Kahneman and Tversky's prospect theory, further reinforces the effect. People experience the pain of losing something they own more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something new. This phenomenon explains why sentimental objects are often valued beyond their market worth. A child's drawing, a wedding ring, an old book. Each holds meaning not because of objective value, but because ownership imbues it with personal history. The implications extend beyond economics. Legal disputes frequently hinge on the endowment effect, as parties in litigation resist settlement offers that would be seen as reasonable from an outside perspective. Intellectual property law is shaped by the same bias as creators overestimate the value of their ideas, often leading to prolonged patent battles and copyright conflicts. Even ideological beliefs are subject to this distortion. Once a person has committed to a particular worldview, they instinctively overvalue their existing opinions, making them resistant to change. This psychological resistance contributes to political polarization, where individuals cling to their perspectives not necessarily because they are correct, but because they feel like an extension of self. Is there a way to see value clearly? The Stoics, particularly Epictetus and Seneca, warned against attachment, arguing that wisdom lies in recognizing the impermanence of all things. Modern financial advisors encourage detachment by reframing losses as sunk costs, a cognitive trick to break the illusion of ownership's special value. Yet, the human mind resists such objectivity. If losing feels more painful than gaining and ownership alters perception, can true rationality ever be achieved? Or are we forever doomed to mistake possession for worth? Technology has not freed us from bias, it has amplified it. The internet was once heralded as a tool for expanding knowledge, breaking ideological silos, and democratizing access to information. Yet, rather than broadening perspectives, it has narrowed them. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement reinforce pre-existing beliefs, shaping a digital landscape where biases are not merely sustained, but deepened. The philosopher Marshall McLuhan warned that every new medium reshapes human cognition, subtly altering the way we perceive and process reality. In the digital age, cognitive biases, confirmation bias, the availability heuristic, the Dunning-Kruger effect, are no longer individual quirks, but systemic forces embedded in the structure of online life. Eli Paris's concept of the filter bubble describes how social media platforms personalize content, feeding users information that aligns with their past behaviors and preferences. While this may enhance user experience, it also ensures that people encounter fewer perspectives that challenge their worldview. Studies by Cass Sunstein demonstrate that individuals exposed to ideologically homogeneous online spaces become more extreme in their views over time, a phenomenon known as group polarization. In effect, algorithms exploit cognitive biases, making it easier for people to indulge in certainty and harder for them to engage in intellectual humility. The availability heuristic, which causes people to overestimate the frequency of dramatic events, is particularly dangerous in a digital world where the most sensational stories are the most widely shared. Fear-based narratives thrive in online ecosystems where outrage and anxiety drive clicks. The result is a world where rare but visually striking dangers, terrorism, violent crime, pandemics dominate the public imagination, while systemic threats like climate change, economic inequality, and chronic disease struggle to gain sustained attention. Paul Slovik's research on risk perception suggests that humans are wired to respond more intensely to immediate, vivid threats than to slow-moving crises, a bias that is now exacerbated by digital media's prioritization of the shocking over the significant. The Dunning-Kruger effect is also intensified in an era where access to information is mistaken for expertise. The The internet offers endless knowledge, but without the ability to critically assess sources, individuals often mistake shallow familiarity for deep understanding. The philosopher Luciano Floridi warns that we now live in an infosphere, where misinformation spreads as easily as truth, eroding the epistemic foundations of society. With Google at their fingertips, people feel knowledgeable without undergoing the rigorous process of genuine learning. This illusion of competence fuels anti-intellectualism, where expertise is dismissed as elitism and simplistic narratives gain traction over complex realities. Can digital technology be restructured to counteract cognitive bias rather than reinforce it? Optimists argue that artificial intelligence and better designed algorithms could prioritize accuracy over engagement, surfacing high-quality information rather than merely popular content. Yet, as Neil Postman observed, technologies rarely serve purely intellectual ends. They evolve according to economic and social incentives. Social media companies profit from attention, not truth, and bias is profitable. If digital tools now shape the way we think, and those tools are engineered to exploit our cognitive weaknesses, do we still control our own minds, or has reason itself become an artifact of the algorithms we consume? Rationality is an aspiration, not a given. The mind, shaped by evolution and constrained by cognitive limitations, does not naturally seek truth. It seeks coherence, comfort, and survival. Cognitive biases, confirmation bias, the sunk cost fallacy, the Dunning-Kruger effect, the availability heuristic, are not glitches in human reasoning. They are its default settings. The realization that we are not fully in control of our own decisions is unsettling. If biases distort perception, influence judgment, and override logic, can we ever truly claim to think freely? The philosopher David Hume argued that reason is the slave of the passions, an instrument used not to discover truth, but to justify pre-existing beliefs. Modern psychology has largely confirmed this view, revealing that the human mind rationalizes before it reasons. If this is the case, then intellectual humility, acknowledging the limits of one's own knowledge, may be the closest thing to wisdom. Yet, the mere awareness of bias is not enough to overcome it. Kahneman warns that cognitive biases are not easily unlearned, even by those who study them. Knowing about the sunk cost fallacy does not prevent individuals from falling into it. Understanding confirmation bias does not eliminate the impulse to defend existing beliefs. Friedrich Nietzsche argued that self-deception is often necessary for psychological survival, that illusions sustain the will to act. The paradox is that while biases mislead, they also provide psychological stability, shaping identities, social cohesion, and moral convictions. If biases were completely eradicated, would we be more rational or simply more paralyzed by uncertainty? Education and structured reasoning offer some resistance. Philosophers from John Stuart Mill to Karl Popper have insisted that the only safeguard against error is a culture of rigorous skepticism, a willingness to challenge assumptions, expose oneself to disconfirming evidence, and embrace intellectual discomfort. Mill's defense of free speech was not merely political, but epistemological. The collision of opposing views, he argued, is essential for refining truth. Yet, in an era of algorithmic reinforcement, where individuals are increasingly insulated from perspectives that challenge their beliefs, this process of self-correction is becoming more difficult. If reason is to survive, it must be cultivated, not assumed. The question remains, how much control do we truly have over our own minds? The Stoics urged detachment, arguing that wisdom lies in mastering one's own thoughts rather than being ruled by them. But in a world where cognitive biases shape everything from elections to personal decisions, the challenge is greater than ever. If bias cannot be eliminated, can it at least be navigated? Perhaps the only true escape is not in believing that we are rational, but in constantly questioning the ways in which we are not. If the greatest illusion is the belief that we see clearly, then the pursuit of truth must begin with a single question: what if we don't? Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced, and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform